August 25th, 1944. A narrow road somewhere between Chartres and Paris. The sun has barely cracked the horizon when Private James Robinson presses his boot against the accelerator of his GMC truck. Behind him stretches a convoy that seems to have no end. Hundreds of identical olive-drab vehicles, their canvas covers stained with dust and diesel smoke, each one loaded with 5-gallon jerry cans of gasoline. Robinson has been driving for 16 hours. His eyes burn. His hands ache from gripping the wheel over cratered roads. But he cannot stop. Ahead of him, somewhere beyond the liberation of Paris, General George Patton's Third Army is grinding to a halt. Not because of German resistance, not because of casualties or broken morale, but because they are running out of fuel. Robinson shifts gears and the truck responds with mechanical certainty. This vehicle, the GMC CKW, known to soldiers simply as the Deuce and a half, was not supposed to be here. British procurement officers had rejected its predecessor as fundamentally flawed. Military analysts had dismissed it as too simple, too underpowered for modern warfare. Yet in this moment, as Robinson joins thousands of other drivers on what would become known as the Red Ball Express, this rejected truck design would prove more valuable than entire divisions of tanks. It would become the iron spine of Allied logistics, the unglamorous machine that turned tactical victories into strategic triumph, and it would be driven primarily by men like Robinson, African-American soldiers serving in a segregated army, fighting for a nation that denied them basic equality at home. The story of how this happened begins not on the battlefields of France, but in the offices and factories of Depression-era America, where engineers wrestled with a problem that seemed almost philosophical. What makes a military vehicle truly useful? In 1940, as Europe descended into total war, the United States Army faced a logistical crisis of imagination. The military establishment understood that mechanization would define the coming conflict. Gone were the days when armies could live off the land, when horse-drawn wagons and railroads could sustain offensive operations. Modern mechanized divisions consumed fuel, ammunition, and spare parts at rates that would have seemed impossible just a generation earlier. A single armored division on the move required more than 300,000 gallons of gasoline per day. Artillery battalions fired shells by the thousands. Infantry divisions needed everything from medical supplies to rations, delivered forward constantly, reliably, in vast quantities. The Army needed trucks, not dozens or hundreds, but tens of thousands, and they needed them to perform under conditions that would destroy civilian vehicles within weeks. They needed to operate on roads reduced to mud, through deserts, across mountain passes, in temperatures ranging from Saharan heat to Russian winter. They needed to be maintained by soldiers with minimal mechanical training, using whatever parts and tools could be scrounged in the field. Above all, they needed to be produced quickly and in staggering numbers. General Motors submitted a design designated the CKWX. It was a 6x6 truck, meaning all 6 wheels could provide power, with a nominal cargo capacity of 2.5 tons. The British Army tested it immediately. They were not impressed. The engine seemed inadequate for the vehicle's weight. The cab design struck them as primitive. British officers compiled reports detailing its shortcomings: insufficient power-to-weight ratio, questionable reliability, awkward handling characteristics. They rejected the ACKWX for their own use and recommended the Americans look elsewhere. But General Motors engineer Harold G. Hamilton saw something the British analysts had missed. The ACKWX's problems were not fundamental. They were fixable. More importantly, Hamilton understood that military logistics in modern war was not about finding the perfect vehicle. It was about finding the adequate vehicle that could be manufactured by the thousands, maintained by mechanics who had been farmers 6 months earlier, and kept running with improvised repairs when official supply lines broke down. Hamilton and his team went back to the drawing board. They redesigned the engine and transmission. They simplified the cab structure. They standardized parts across the vehicle's systems. What emerged was designated the CKW, a designation that would mean nothing to most people, but which would become legendary among the soldiers who depended on it. The changes were not revolutionary. The CKW did not represent any great technological breakthrough. It was still fundamentally simple. An inline six-cylinder engine producing 104 horsepower, a four-speed manual transmission, a transfer case that could shift between two-wheel and six-wheel drive, a steel chassis, and a cargo bed that could carry 5,000 pounds. What made it remarkable was what Hamilton had deliberately left out. There were no complex systems that required specialized tools to repair, no proprietary parts that could only be sourced from GM factories, no sophisticated features that would fail in the mud and cold. The CCKW was designed around a principle that military planners would only later articulate clearly. Reliability is more valuable than capability. A truck that runs adequately every single day is worth more than a truck with superior performance that breaks down and requires parts that will not arrive for 3 weeks. Production began in 1941. By the time the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, GM's factories were already churning out CCKWs at a rate that seemed impossible. Assembly lines in Pontiac, Michigan, and St. Louis, Missouri ran around the clock. Workers who had been building civilian cars months earlier now riveted together military trucks with assembly line precision. The production numbers were staggering. In 1942 alone, General Motors manufactured over 50,000 CCKWs. By 1943, production had accelerated to where a new truck rolled off the line every 4 minutes during peak shifts. The trucks went everywhere. They hauled supplies across North Africa as Allied forces pushed Rommel back to Tunisia. They carried wounded soldiers from aid stations to field hospitals in Italy. They transported ammunition to artillery batteries, food to infantry companies, mail to homesick soldiers stationed in the Pacific. The CCKW proved itself adaptable beyond its original design parameters. Engineers mounted anti-aircraft guns on their beds. Mechanics converted them into mobile workshops. Medical Corps units transformed them into ambulances. Some were fitted with snow plows, others with cranes, still others with water tanks or fuel pumps. But it was in Europe, in the summer of 1944, that the CCKW would face its ultimate test, not as a combat vehicle, but as the foundation of the most ambitious logistics operation of the entire war. June 6, 1944. The invasion of Normandy succeeded beyond the most optimistic Allied projections. By the end of the first day, over 150,000 troops had landed on 5 beaches along the Norman coast. Within a week, the Allies had established a foothold. Within a month, they had broken out of the initial beachhead and begun pushing inland. General Omar Bradley's forces liberated Cherbourg. British and Canadian units ground forward toward Caen. And on July 25th, General George Patton's Third Army launched Operation Cobra, a massive offensive that shattered German defensive lines and opened France to rapid Allied advance. The German army in France began to collapse. Units that had held their positions for weeks suddenly found themselves outflanked, surrounded, cut off. Patton's armored divisions raced forward at speeds that seemed impossible in modern warfare. In one day, his tanks covered over 60 miles. Towns and villages that German commanders had expected to defend for weeks fell in hours. By mid-August, Paris was liberated. By September, Allied forces were approaching the German border itself. It was a triumph of tactics and courage. It was also a logistics nightmare. The Allied plan had assumed a methodical advance. Planners calculated supply requirements based on the expectation that armies would move forward at perhaps 15 miles per day, pausing to consolidate gains, allowing rear echelon units to establish proper supply depots and fuel dumps. But Patton was not moving at 15 miles per day. He was moving at 50, sometimes 60. His tanks were consuming fuel faster than logistics officers had thought possible. His artillery was firing thousands more shells per day than pre-invasion estimates had projected. And crucially, the supply line from the beaches of Normandy to the forward units stretched over 300 miles, a distance that grew longer every single day. The Allies had planned to use French railroads to move supplies inland, but the Germans, in their retreat, had systematically destroyed rail lines, blown bridges, and demolished switching yards. The infrastructure that should have supported the advance simply did not exist, nor could Allied forces easily capture intact ports closer to the front lines. The Germans held on to channel ports like Calais and Dunkirk with fanatical determination, and when they finally withdrew, they left behind such complete destruction that it took months to make the ports operational again. By mid-August, the situation had become critical. Patton's Third Army was stalling not because of enemy action, but because its tanks literally did not have enough fuel to continue operations. Artillery batteries were rationing shells. Infantry divisions were running low on basic supplies, food, medical equipment, ammunition. Staff officers calculated that if the supply crisis was not resolved immediately, the entire Allied advance would stop. The Germans, given time to regroup and establish new defensive lines, might prolong the war by months or even years. The solution that emerged was as desperate as it was ambitious: a massive, continuous truck convoy system that would bypass the destroyed railroads entirely. Supplies would be loaded onto trucks at the Normandy beaches, driven directly to forward depots near the front lines, and the trucks would immediately return for another load. It would operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no breaks, no pauses, no rest. They would dedicate entire roads exclusively to this convoy, civilian traffic banned, military police stationed at every intersection to ensure nothing interfered with the flow. The operation would require thousands of trucks, tens of thousands of soldiers, and millions of gallons of fuel to transport millions more gallons of fuel forward. They called it the Red Ball Express. The name came from railroad terminology. Rail freight marked with red balls received priority handling. It moved first, it moved fast, it moved constantly. On August 25, 1944, the first Red Ball convoys began rolling out of depots near the Normandy coast. The trucks moved in tight convoy formation, 30 to 40 vehicles per group, each group spaced to allow mechanical failures to be pushed aside without disrupting the flow. The lead vehicle in each convoy carried a sign marking it as Red Ball, and mounted on the front of nearly every truck was the distinctive split windshield and blunt nose of the GMC CCKW. The operation demanded almost impossible logistics. Each truck needed to be loaded with exactly 5 tons of cargo. Overload it, and the suspension would fail. Underload it, and you wasted capacity. The cargo had to be secured properly, or it would shift during the journey and potentially cause accidents. Drivers received strict instructions about convoy speed, spacing, and behavior. They were to maintain 35 miles per hour on good roads, slower on damaged stretches. They were to keep 50 yards between trucks, close enough to maintain convoy integrity, far enough to avoid chain reaction collisions. They were forbidden from leaving the designated routes. They were ordered to continue driving even if strafed by enemy aircraft or if they came under artillery fire. And crucially, the drivers were to continue for as long as humanly possible. Shifts of 20 hours were not uncommon. Some drivers reported being on the road for 36 hours straight, sustained by nothing but coffee and amphetamines distributed by medical officers who understood that exhaustion was killing as many men as enemy action. 75% of the Red Ball Express drivers were African American. The United States Army in World War II was a segregated institution. Black soldiers served in separate units from white soldiers. They ate in separate mess halls, slept in separate barracks, and were commanded almost exclusively by white officers. The military establishment believed, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, that black soldiers were unsuitable for combat roles. They were relegated instead to support positions: engineers, stevedores, supply clerks, and drivers. The men of the Red Ball Express came from every corner of America. They were farmers from Alabama and factory workers from Detroit, college students and day laborers, men who had grown up driving tractors, and men who had learned to handle a truck only after joining the Army. What united them was not background, but circumstance. They had been assigned to quartermaster units because of their race, and now those same quartermaster units were being thrown into the most critical logistics operation of the European War. Private James Robinson, who had pressed his boot against the accelerator that August morning, had grown up in Mississippi. He had joined the Army in 1942, hoping to serve as a pilot or in the infantry. Instead, he was assigned to the 3,607th Quartermaster Truck Company and spent months driving supplies across England in preparation for the invasion. Now in France, he found himself part of an operation that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. The conditions were brutal. Drivers navigated roads that had been cratered by artillery. their surfaces reduced to rutted mud that could swallow a truck's wheel to the axle. They drove under blackout conditions at night. No headlights, only tiny cat's eye lamps that provided barely enough illumination to see the truck ahead. German aircraft, increasingly desperate as Allied air superiority tightened, would strafe convoy routes, and the only defense was to keep moving and hope the fighter-bomber pilot chose a different target. Ambush by bypassed German units remained a constant threat, though it happened less frequently than drivers feared. The greater enemy was fatigue. A man who had been driving for 18 hours straight began to hallucinate. He saw shapes on the road that were not there. He misjudged distances and curves. His reaction time slowed until he was barely able to respond to emergencies. Accidents were common. Trucks rolled into ditches when exhausted drivers fell asleep at the wheel. Collisions occurred when someone failed to notice the vehicle ahead had stopped. The casualties from accidents exceeded the casualties from enemy action. Yet the convoys continued. Hour after hour, day after day, the trucks rolled forward. At its peak, the Red Ball Express had nearly 6,000 trucks on the roads simultaneously. They moved in an endless stream along designated routes marked with Red Ball symbols painted on signs and posted at every intersection. Military police stationed at checkpoints ensured that nothing, no staff car, no ambulance, no general's personal vehicle, interfered with the flow. Everything else yielded to Red Ball. The trucks carried everything. Jerry cans of gasoline, each one containing 5 gallons, hundreds of them loaded onto a single vehicle. Artillery shells packed in wooden crates. Medical supplies, food, spare parts for tanks and aircraft, ammunition for rifles and machine guns. Mail from home. The cargo did not matter. What mattered was that it moved forward constantly, feeding the appetite of armies that consumed supplies faster than any military planner had thought possible. And the GMC CCKW proved itself under conditions its designers could never have anticipated. Trucks ran until their engines seized, were repaired in the field with improvised parts, and ran again. When a vehicle broke down beyond immediate repair, mechanics would cannibalize it for parts to keep other trucks running. The CCKW's simple design meant that a determined mechanic with basic tools could fix almost anything. Replace a fuel pump with one salvaged from a wrecked truck, jury-rig a broken accelerator linkage with wire and hope, patch a leaking radiator with whatever material was available, and fill it with water from a roadside stream. The trucks were not perfect. They broke down regularly. The suspension systems, designed for 2.5 tons, frequently carried 5 or 6 tons and suffered accordingly. Transmissions failed. Tires blew out on roads littered with debris. Engines overheated under the strain of constant operation. But they kept running. When a CCKW broke down, it could usually be fixed. When it could not be fixed immediately, it could be towed aside and its cargo transferred to another vehicle. The convoy did not stop. From August to November 1944, the Red Ball Express delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies to forward units. The operation involved more than 6,000 trucks and over 23,000 soldiers, most of them black, most of them operating under conditions of exhaustion that would have broken less determined men. They drove routes that totaled over 5 million miles, the equivalent of driving to the moon and back more than 10 times. The impact was immediate and profound. Patton's Third Army, which had been on the verge of stalling completely, received enough fuel to continue its advance. Bradley's First Army maintained offensive operations. The liberation of France, which might have bogged down into a grinding stalemate, instead proceeded at speeds that caught even German commanders by surprise. By November, when the Red Ball Express officially stood down, Allied forces had reached Germany's western border. The final campaigns that would end the war in Europe had become possible because drivers like James Robinson had kept their trucks moving. The Red Ball Express was not flawless. Commanders criticized its inefficiency. Trucks returning empty from forward depots represented wasted capacity. The accident rate was horrifically high, with exhausted drivers causing collisions that killed soldiers and destroyed equipment. The fuel consumed by the trucks themselves represented a significant percentage of the fuel they carried forward, leading some logistics officers to calculate that the operation barely broke even on gasoline deliveries. But these criticisms missed the essential point. The Red Ball Express was never meant to be efficient. It was meant to be sufficient. It was a desperate response to an unexpected crisis, a brute force solution that prioritized volume and speed over elegance. And in that context, it succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. The success rested on three pillars. First, the GMC CKW truck itself, a vehicle so fundamentally simple and reliable that it could be maintained under field conditions by soldiers with minimal mechanical training. Second, the organizational structure that treated the operation as a military campaign in its own right, with dedicated routes, traffic control, and command authority. And third, the drivers themselves, men who drove until they could barely see, who navigated by instinct when fatigue clouded their minds, who kept going because they understood that soldiers at the front were counting on them. The irony was impossible to ignore. These men were fighting for a country that treated them as second-class citizens. They wore the same uniform as white soldiers, but could not eat in the same mess halls. They served under officers who often viewed them with open contempt. They would return home after the war to face segregation, discrimination, and violence. Yet they drove their trucks with a dedication that proved essential to Allied victory. Some military historians have argued that the Red Ball Express represented the moment when the American military began, however reluctantly, to recognize that racial segregation was not merely unjust, but operationally stupid. The truck companies had performed under conditions that would have tested any unit in the Army. They had done so despite being given the most thankless mission in the theater. And they had done so while facing discrimination that should have destroyed morale but somehow did not. After the Red Ball Express stood down in November 1944, other truck convoy operations continued under different names. The White Ball Express, the Red Lion Express. But none achieved the same scale or impact. By that point, Allied forces had captured ports closer to the front lines, and while supply problems remained significant, they never again reached the crisis level of August and September 1944. The GMC CKW continued serving throughout the rest of the war and for decades afterward. By the time production ended in 1945, General Motors had manufactured over 560,000 of them. They served in every theater of the war. Soviet forces received thousands through Lend-Lease and used them on the Eastern Front. They transported supplies across the Burma Road into China. They landed with invasion forces in the Philippines and Okinawa. After the war, they served in Korea, in Vietnam, in countless smaller conflicts. Surplus CKWS ended up in the hands of militaries across the world, and in some nations, they remained in service into the 1990s. The truck's longevity testified to the wisdom of Harold Hamilton's design philosophy. By making it simple, he made it repairable. By making it reliable, he made it invaluable. By making it producible in vast numbers, he made it ubiquitous. The CKW was never the best military truck in the world. There were vehicles with more power, better handling, superior off-road capability, but it was good enough, and there were enough of them, and that proved more valuable than excellence. The legacy of the Red Ball Express extends beyond logistics. For the African-American soldiers who served in the truck companies, the operation represented both vindication and frustration. They had proved themselves capable under conditions that broke other men. They had demonstrated courage, dedication, and competence. Yet they returned to an army and a nation that continued to treat them as inferior. But something had changed. The performance of black soldiers in quartermaster units, in the Red Ball Express, in the combat units that finally saw action late in the war, made certain arguments impossible to sustain. The military establishment could no longer credibly claim that black soldiers lacked the ability to perform complex tasks under pressure. The evidence contradicted that assertion too thoroughly. It would take years. The Army was not fully integrated until 1948 under President Truman's executive order. But the process began in part because of operations like the Red Ball Express. James Robinson survived the war. He returned to Mississippi, where he could not vote, where he had to enter restaurants through the back door, where he lived under a system of apartheid that the United States had supposedly been fighting against in Europe. He told his story to his children and grandchildren, the story of driving through the night, of keeping the convoy moving, of delivering the fuel that kept the Army advancing. And he told them that he was proud of what he had done, even if the country he served had not yet become the country it claimed to be. In the decades that followed, military historians came to understand something that was not obvious during the war itself. Logistics wins wars. Tactics and strategy matter, but armies march on their supply lines. The most brilliant general cannot advance without fuel for his tanks. The most courageous soldiers cannot fight without ammunition. The side that can sustain its forces in the field, that can deliver supplies reliably and continuously, gains an advantage that can overcome almost any other factor. The Red Ball Express was not the most dramatic operation of World War II. There were no desperate last stands, no brilliant tactical maneuvers, no moments of individual heroism that changed the course of battle. It was simply men driving trucks, hour after hour, day after day. But in the calculus of war, those trucks and those men proved as valuable as entire armored divisions. And the GMC CCKW, the rejected truck that was too simple, too underpowered, too unimpressive for British procurement officers, became one of the most important weapons of the war. Not because it was excellent, but because it was adequate in overwhelming numbers. Not because it represented the cutting edge of technology, but because it represented the wisdom of designing for reliability rather than performance. Not because it was used by elite troops, but because it was used by ordinary soldiers who proved themselves extraordinary when given the chance. This is the lesson that echoes across decades. Wars are won not only by the weapons that make headlines, but by the unglamorous systems that keep armies functioning. Victory belongs not only to those who fight on the front lines, but to those who ensure that the fighters have what they need. And sometimes the most important contribution to a just cause comes from those whom society values least, who serve despite being denied the very freedoms they fight to preserve. The Red Ball Express operated for less than 4 months. In the scope of a war that lasted 6 years, it was a brief moment. But in that moment, on roads across France, in trucks designed by an engineer who understood that simplicity was strength, driven by soldiers who deserved better than they received, the Allies found a way to turn tactical victories into strategic triumph. They found a way to sustain an advance that liberated a continent. They found a way to win.